Hello everyone, and welcome to another XML layout tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how you can create your own custom XML tags, which are custom elements that use their own XML. For this tutorial, we're going to create a simple window tag, which will give us a window similar to the one you can see in the example here, to put whatever content we might choose to use. So this is a brand new project with nothing in it but XML layout. I've created a empty tutorial scene, and this is where we're going to start from. So the first step is to create a tutorial XML file for this scene. So we will right click, say UI, XML layout, add new XML layout. This is to open the add new XML layout window. We don't have an XML layout file for this yet, so we'll create a new one. We'll call it tutorial, nothing more than that. And for this example, we don't need a controller, so I'm just going to leave that set to none. Okay, there we go. There's our new XML layout. You can see we've got our tutorial XML file, which is currently empty. We're going to start by creating the XML for our window in the tutorial XML file, just so that we can see what we're doing. We'll move it into its own XML file later. So I'm going to open the tutorial XML file, and the first thing I'm going to do is include the style sheet from the XML layout examples. This is just to sort of save time and let us get a bit of a head start. And from here we can start creating the actual XML for our window. I'm going to use quite a few styles from the style sheet that we've just included, so don't worry if you don't recognize the class name. It has been defined in our style sheet. So we'll start by using a table layout with a couple of properties. We're going to set its class to no cell background, which is a style that we've defined that doesn't have a background image for each individual cell. We're going to say use global cell padding is false because we don't want to use that. And I'm going to add a hide animation because we're going to want to do some hiding later. More on that when we get to it. I'm going to add the first row, which is our header row. So we're going to set a class of header row. And then we are going to add a single cell to this header row with a text element in it. That text element is going to be our title. So we set class title. And we're also going to give it an ID of title so that we can reference it later on. A second row will contain our content. We're going to give it a class of viewport, which is also defined in our style sheet. We add one cell again. Don't use table cell background is going to be true. We don't want to use the default background image for this table. We're going to give it a padding value of 10 just because it looks nice, and we're going to give it an ID of content so that we can reference it later. We need to reference it so that we can add the actual content to the table cell for our window. So let's go and have a look and see what we get. There we go. We've got a very basic window. We've got the header row at the top, and we've got the content at the bottom. With the basic XML in place, I think we're ready to create our window XML file. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click on my tutorial folder. I'm going to say create XML layout, new XML layout file. We're going to call this window, and we're going to copy the contents of our tutorial XML file into the window XML file. Just override it like that, and then we can remove the existing window from the XML layout file for our tutorial. And from here we can now create the actual tag handler. Before we do that, however, we should first create a resource database for our tutorial so that we can access the window XML file. We need to be able to access it within XML layout, so it must be within a resource database or resources folder. So we're going to go create XML layout, resources, custom resource database, and we'll just call it tutorial resource database. It's a fairly simple one. We're just going to say monitor containing folder, which tells it to monitor all resources in the folder that it is in, and we will just click refresh. You'll see that we've now got a couple of items in there. The one that we're particularly interested in is window over here. We will be referencing that in our tag handler code. Now we're going to create the tag handler class. Now a tag handler class is a C# class which basically defines how a particular tag works. So we start by right-clicking on our tutorial folder again, saying create XML layout, new XML layout element tag handler. We just have to wait for Unity to finish compiling quickly as it's a new C# class, and then we can rename it to window tag handler. Now we open the class. First thing we need to do is rename the class to match its new file name. And then I'm going to start by removing all the comments because you don't need those. Well, not in this case. As well as pretty much most of the functionality here. We'll be adding some back over time, but I wanted to go into detail about each particular type. Okay, so we got window tag handler, which extends element tag handler. This is the default element tag handler, but we actually want to use a special one called base tag handler. We find it in ui.xml.tags.base.xml tag handler. The difference between the base XML tag handler and the element tag handler is that the base XML tag handler has been set up to allow you to use your own XML, whereas the regular element tag handler expects a prefab or some other form of pre-ready object. Okay, so from here, I want to just quickly show you the first property, is custom element. Now, this property is what XML layout uses to determine whether or not this particular tag handler should be added to the autocomplete file. If that property is false, which it is by default, then that tag handler will not be added to the autocomplete file and you won't be able to see it when you try and create it in XML. So it's the first and probably most important property. That doesn't mean that it won't work, but it won't show up in the XML autocomplete, which can make your life a little bit difficult. I'd also like to show you an extra step here which you can add. This is optional, but if you do the following by using the element tag handler annotation, you can specify a specific name for your tag, which was what you will use in XML. By default, what XML layout does is it extracts the name from the name of the class by removing tag handler and using whatever is left, but it's probably better to specify it explicitly by passing a string to this attribute. Okay, so from here, what we want to do is start defining which XML file to use. So we're going to override one of the base XML properties called XML path. You'll see there's also a property called XML which allows you to specify the XML directly in the C# code if that's what you want, but normally you're going to want to use a specific file rather. Okay, so in this case, we're going to return the path, which is simply window. That's the path in our resource database, and that's the path we're going to use here. If you've got a more complicated path, then be sure to use that, but in this case, it's just window. Okay, so from there, what we can do now is our element should actually be available in our tutorial file now. You'll notice that I swapped to the main window just to allow it to recompile and regenerate the XSD file, which is the autocomplete file. If we now go window, it should show up in the autocomplete. Please note that sometimes it does take Visual Studio or whichever editor you're using a moment or two to catch up. You'll see there it wasn't available there, but it is available now. Okay, so from here we should now have our window, and there you go, here it is. With the basic work in place, we can now look into just resizing our window here just so that it looks a little bit better, and I think we'll probably add a second one just so that we can show you how that works as well. So first thing we're going to do is set the width and height. And we're going to align this window to the left side, middle left, and give it a small offset from the edge. Then we're going to copy it and create a second window with similar settings, except it's going to be on the middle right, and it's going to be offset from the right edge. There we go. We've now got two small windows, and we can start working on the code to make them function correctly. Returning to our window tag handler, we're going to start by defining which attributes are available to our window tag. The first attribute that we want is going to be a title text attribute to define what text is shown in the title text element. So again, we're going to override an existing property of this called attributes, and this dictionary returns a property of attributes. So what we want to do is return new dictionary string, and the first attribute we're going to add here is called title text, and its type is XS string. This is a XML type for the XSD file. So for your average sort of data type like strings and integers and floats and booleans, it's just going to be XS string, XS boolean, that sort of thing. There are more complicated data types available which have been defined by XML layout, like a color block or a rect offset, and in that case it would be XML layout rect offset or something along those lines. You can find more information about that on the XML layout documentation page. Okay, so by adding our title text attribute here to our collection of attributes, we should now be able to use it on our element. First, we'll switch back to the window here to allow XML layout to update the XSD file, and then we'll return to our tutorial file and check to see if we can add the attribute here. So, title text. And we're going to call this window 1, and we're going to add the second one, window 2. All right, now just because the attribute is available in the autocomplete doesn't mean that it does anything yet. We need to actually add the code that will do that. Now there's several approaches to doing this, and I'm going to show you a couple of them, but the first one will be the simplest, which is to override the apply attributes behavior of this tag handler. So we override the method called apply attributes. We allow it to call base.apply attributes because that's necessary. It handles a lot of internal attribute functionality. But what we're going to do is we're going to add to it. So what we will do is we will say if our attributes to apply collection, this is the attributes that are being applied right now, dot contains a key of title text, which is the name of our new attribute, then we're going to have some behavior which is executed in that case. In this case, it's fairly simple. What we want to do is we want to access a particular element and we want to set the text value of that element. So, first thing we need to do is we need to access the XML layout property, the XML layout instance of the current tag so that we can execute the get element by ID function to find our title text. To make our life easier, I'm going to add a small property to do this, which we'll just call layout. So we'll say private XML layout with some get functionality, and this is just going to return current instance transform. This is the rect transform of the element that we are working with right now. Dot get component XML layout. Okay, now we can use the layout property elsewhere in our code as follows. Get element by ID. We're specifically looking for a text element, and the ID is title. And now we can just set the text, attributes to apply, title text. All right. Now, if we go back to our window, we allow it to compile, of course, you'll see that our title text has shown up. Now that our title properties are working, we can start looking into how to add content to our window. So we'll go back to our tutorial XML file, and I'm just going to put in a little bit of content for these windows. I've created this in advance, which is just simply a panel with some text in it. And we've got two of them, and we're going to modify the second one very slightly. We'll make the second one have yellow text. Now, if we go back to the window, it's not going to look quite right yet. You'll see that the panel has been added directly as a child of our window. So it's not actually in our content section. It's covering the entire window. So what we need to do is tell XML layout where the children of our content should go. So in this case, if I show you on the hierarchy, you'll see where we actually want our children to go is here, but right now it's actually here. So what we need to do is define a way for XML layout to find the right transform to add children to for this tag. In our case, we want it to be added to the content cell that we defined earlier. So we go back to the window tag handler code, and we're going to override a property called transform to add children to. This is specifically what transform should the children of this tag be added to. By default, it is added directly to itself, but we're going to override that and change it to use layout.getElementById, and we'll take the rect transform component, and we're going to specify the content ID, which, if you have a look at our window XML file, is the cell. All right, so let's go and have a look. We let it recompile and rebuild our XML layout instance. You'll see that our content has now been added to the correct child in the correct place. From here, I'd like to extend our window tag a little bit so that we can add a button which can be used to close the window. So we'll go back to our window XML file, which is here, and we're going to add a button to the header row. We're going to start by giving it an ID of close button so that we can access it later, because maybe our users would want to hide the button or show the button. So we give it an ID so we can do that. We're going to set it to false, the active to false by default, so it is not shown by default. We're going to give it an icon. This is one of the icons from the XML layout examples. Just a cancel. And then we're going to position it. The first thing we're going to do is, because it's a child of a cell, which is a layout, we're going to tell it to ignore layout, because we want to specify its position manually. We set the width to 32, the height to 32. We align it with the right-hand side, middle right, and we give it a small offset from the right edge. The reason why we're not using a layout in this case is because we don't want the position of the button to affect the position of the text in any way. I'm going to set active to true very quickly so that you can have a look and see how it appears by default. There we go, a very simple little close button. We can set that back to false now. And what we want is, when this button is clicked, we want to hide the container. So we're going to call the hide method. Now, you could call any method you want here, but we're calling hide because it already exists on an XML layout controller. So you don't have to define a new method to hide something. We can just use the existing one. Now, this won't work yet because, in truth, we don't have a layout controller on our windows. You'll see we've got error messages if we attempt to run it. It says attempted to process an event attribute for an XML layout with no XML layout controller added or attached. Sorry. So what we actually want to do now is we want to create a XML layout controller for our window tag. So once again, we right-click on our tutorial folder, we say create XML layout, and we say new XML layout controller. Like, once again, because it's a new C# class, we've got to wait for Unity to finish compiling, and then we can rename it. We're going to call it window controller. All right, now if we open it, we need to just quickly also rename the class inside the file. to window controller, and we can also delete the layout rebuild method because we're not going to use it right now. Alright, so we'll allow that to recompile quickly, clear those error messages, and now we can return to the window tag handler so that we can specify that we need to use this controller for this particular tag. So what we go over here is we override a property called controller type, which expects a C# type. So what we do is we say return type of window controller. And that is all that is necessary for that. XML layout will now add a window controller to each of the window instances. So if we return to our window, we rebuild, and we have a look at our window instances, you'll see that we now have a window controller object there, which we can now use to process events, such as our hide. The next step is we need to add our hide attribute to the collection of attributes that are available. So we'll say show close button, and it's going to be a type Boolean, which is true or false, or 0 or 1. And now we need to add the functionality to make it actually work. So we say if attributes to apply dot contains key show close button, we will quite simply go layout.get element by ID. In this case, we don't need to specify a type because we don't particularly care what type it is. We just want to show or hide it. So we say dot set active, dot game object dot set active, and we need to parse the value of attributes to apply. So we say attributes to apply show close button because we're expecting a Boolean here. So we say to Boolean. XML layout comes with a lot of extension methods for strings, such as this one, to convert a string value from an attribute to a C# value. In this case, it will convert true, false strings into a Boolean value. And now we'll just quickly allow it to recompile, and then return to our tutorial file, and we'll say show close button equals true on the first window, and we'll leave it alone on the second one. And there you go. You can see our window has a close button on the left, and the one on the right does not, because we did not specify one. Now the hide method is defined on the controller by default, so we don't have to add it, so this should work already. And there you go, using our shrink animation that we defined earlier. This concludes the basics of creating your own XML tag. But what I'd like to do now is show you a couple of ideas about how we could go about this differently, so you can see what works for you and use that method. The first thing I'm going to do is try and move some of the functionality from the window tag handler into the window tag controller so that we can change it at runtime without having to go through the tag handler. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to make the window text and close button properties part of the controller. So we go to our window controller, which is basically empty at this point, and we're going to start adding some properties to it. What we're going to do first is we're going to create a property for the title text. So we'll create a string called title text, which will be empty by default, and we're going to create a public accessor for it called title text with a get, which simply returns our internal variable, and a more complicated set, which sets the value of that variable. And the reason why we've done it this way is because this allows us to respond to changes to the value. I'm going to just add this here quickly, which says serialize field. What this does is it tells Unity to store the value of this private variable, because by default Unity will not record the value of private variables, only public variables. But in this case we've got a specialized property which allows us to record the value like we would with a normal variable, but also have get and set accessors for it. So what we need now that we have the property is we need a method of reacting to the changes to that property. So we're going to create a reference to the title text element with our XML element reference class. So we say private XML element reference, sorry, not with the I, okay, with a type of text, because it's a reference to a text element called title text element. And by default, this will be null. Now, sorry, I need to include unityengine.ui in order to use text, because it's located there. Now we need a method of populating this title text element, because we cannot instantiate it here, unfortunately. So what we'll do is we'll create an awake method for this controller, which will create a reference for us. So we say, if I can type this correctly, title text element equals XML element reference, which is a method provided by the XML layout controller class with a type of text, and the string argument is going to be our ID. Okay, so what we have now is we have an element reference which refers to the text element with the ID of title, which we can use at any point in time. The XML element reference is essentially a wrapped version of XML layout.getElement by ID, but what it does is it maintains its references no matter what. So if, for example, you rebuild your layout, if you've stored a reference to something returned by getElement by ID, that value will now be null because the original element will have been destroyed and replaced. Whereas if you use the XML element reference class, it will update its internal references to match. Okay, so now that we have the title text element, we can use it. So we can say title text element dot element, because this refers to the element contained by the reference, dot text is equal to the value we've just been provided. Now we go back to our window tag handler, and instead of setting the text directly like this, we just go, we have to access the controller first. So like we did with the layout reference earlier, we're going to add a reference to the controller. So we say private window controller with a get accessor, return current instance transform dot get component window controller. Simple again. Now we can go controller dot title text is equal to attributes to apply title text. So what happens now is when the apply attributes value is called, instead of applying the value directly to the element, it applies it to the controller, and the controller handles the behavior of setting the value on the element. And this is nice because then even at runtime, if you can reference this controller and this title text property with your C# code, and you can make changes to it without needing to go through anything else. If we return to our code now, with any luck, our title text will still work. And there we go. You may notice in some cases this might stop working in edit mode. For example, we've got a bit of a broken thing here. So what we need to do is we need to add the following to our controller. We say execute in edit mode. The reason for that is now the awake method will be executed in edit mode, whereas before it wouldn't have, only in play mode. So our element is actually referenced and will show up. If we quickly get it to compile again and rebuild, you'll see it now works in edit mode. All right, so that's our title text property. What I'd like to do next is do the same for our show close button property. To do so, we're going to follow basically the same steps. So we'll go serialize field, private boolean, show close button, and it will be false by default. Okay, public bool show close button. Again, with the get and a set, the get will be return our internal value, and the set will set our internal value. Now, as before, we need a way to reference our close button, so we'll go private XML element reference, and we're just going to use XML element this time, the default value, because all we need to do is reference the element's game object. We don't need to reference any of its components. So we'll go change, this is the close button element, and it was also going to have a default value of null. And as with the title text, we will instantiate it in awake. And we'll just say XML element reference. In this case, we don't need to pass it type object because that is the default value. And we use the ID of close button, which should match our Windows close button. Here we go. We have a reference now, so all we need to do is in the set method, use it. So we say close button element dot element dot game object dot set active value. The value being true or false that we've been provided. Now we can go back to our window tag handler like we did with the title text element, and we can say controller dot show close button is equal to attributes to apply show close button dot to boolean. All right, now this should all work as before. So if we return to our window and we say play and we click the close button, it works. And you can also see that the close button shows up on window 1 but not on window 2, so our attribute is still working correctly despite the fact that we're no longer setting the value directly here. So now our controller is doing most of the work, but it can still be something of a pain to have to specify your attributes manually one by one here. So I'm going to show you a little trick you can use to make your own custom elements work even more easily. Now this base.apply attributes method here uses reflection to locate properties on your class and apply attribute values to them. Now it's a fairly complicated process, but for now what you need to know is that if you specify a particular type, which is, sorry, not a type, a particular component, which is the primary component of this tag, then XML Layout will attempt to apply values from attributes to that component without you needing to manually specify them like here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to delete this completely. In fact, seeing as we're not making any other changes to the apply attributes method itself, we can actually delete the entire method and Unity will just inherit it from the parent. And what we're going to do now is specify which component is the primary. Just to show you that it's all not working again after the changes we've made, you should see basically our title's gone, our close button is gone because the properties are no longer being applied. So what we do now is we override a property called primary component. And we're going to override that with a value of current instance transform dot get component window controller. So what we're telling it in this case is the window controller is the primary component of this tag, and so it should attempt to apply any attribute values that it can find against properties of that type. So it will also apply properties to rect transform, images, and a couple of other components as well. But what you need to know for now is that it's going to attempt to apply the values that we've retrieved from our attributes to this window controller. So it's going to take our, go back to the tutorial file. It's going to take our title text and show close button properties, and it's going to look for properties that match their names. They don't have to match case. And then it will attempt to apply those attributes directly to them without needing you to do any extra work. So we've got our title text property and our show close button property, which match those two properties by name. So from there, just have a look. We should see it. And if we rebuild now, they're working again. And as you can see, our attribute code from here is gone. We actually don't have to handle any of the attributes manually. This is very useful for simple attributes with a specific type that can be easily converted without any extra work on your part. If you've got a really advanced attribute or it requires any more handling other than just directly applying the value to the property, then you may want to do some apply attributes code after all. But in this case, it can make your life a lot easier, seeing as you don't have to actually handle each individual attribute one by one, and if you like, you can handle some attributes and not others. XML Layout will attempt to apply values for all that it can find, and then it will call your apply attributes code, which can override anything that doesn't already match. I think we're going to call it there for today. I hope that this tutorial has been useful to you, and with any luck, I'll have some more for you in the near future. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for purchasing XML Layout. Cheers.